Cora reached the edge of the clearing, just as the sun gave up its hold on the Georgia sky, the wind rustling through the dried, brittle stalks of the abandoned indigo fields, leaving only the sound of her own exhausted footsteps dragging across the red clay. The ragged flour sack clutched against her chest felt like it held anvils, but the true weight wasn't the few frayed dresses hidden inside that worn fabric. It was the crushing burden of the life she was walking away from. It was the phantom weight of a master who had taken his pleasure, emptied her of her youth, and then tossed her out with a crumpled manumission paper, discarding her like a hound that could no longer hunt. It was the ache of a mother still bound to the blistering fields of the big house, a mother who couldn't even step off the dirt path to weep as she watched her daughter leave. Most of all, it was the heavy burden of 8 months of a child growing inside her, a terror carried in utter isolation by a woman who didn't know if she'd ever find solid ground to rest her bare feet again. Cora stared at the rough-hewn log cabin, its roof of overlapping cedar shakes cutting a jagged line against a twilight, bruised with deep purples and fiery oranges. She swallowed the question that had been haunting her every step of the grueling 2-day trek since she had sent word to old Hattie, her heavy belly making every mile feel like 10. Would there still be a corner in this world for someone like me? The heavy oak door creaked open before her knuckles could even graze the wood. Aunt Hattie stood on the threshold, bathed in the sputtering yellow glow of a tallow candle dripping from inside the dog-trot cabin. She might have been 72 years old or maybe 68. Cora could never be certain, because women who had been stolen across the dark waters in the stifling bellies of ships didn't carry their birth years with them. The passage of time had carved Hattie's face the way the river carves stone, a terrain mapped only on women who had swallowed more grief than a human frame was built to hold, yet somehow refused to bow. Her eyes were the color of river water cleared by years of hard rain, carrying a depth of suffering and an unshakable, silent wisdom. A simple, faded head wrap held back her stark white hair, and the body Cora, once remembered as a fortress of strength, had withered into something reedy. She was bone-thin in a way that made you catch your breath, the thinness of a creature who labors far more than she eats. Yet, there was an iron core to her, a sacred thing the lash couldn't shatter, something the overseer, the slave quarters, and the endless years of bondage had utterly failed to extinguish. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace, Hattie descended the wooden steps, her weathered hand gripping the split rail banister. As her gaze settled on Cora, the little girl she hadn't seen since she was 7, playing in the dust behind the slave cabins of the sprawling cotton plantation, now standing before her as a newly freed, terrified, and heavily pregnant woman, a dampness gathered in the old woman's eyes. But no tears fell, for Hattie had learned decades ago that weeping when others desperately required a pillar of strength was an indulgence women of her blood could not afford. "Step inside, child, come on in now, for the night air is too bitter for a mother to be." She demanded no explanations about the past. She didn't press for the name of the man who planted the seed, nor did she question whose signature was on those freedom papers or why he had let her go. She merely reached out and took the heavy flour sack, heavy because Cora had packed her entire shattered history inside it, and turned back toward the threshold, letting the younger woman follow her like a moth drawn to the only light in a pitch-black swamp. The heat of the cabin wrapped around Cora like a thick woolen quilt, radiating from the deep cast-iron hearth that Hattie kept burning day and night, tending the embers so the fire never truly gave up its ghost. The aromas hitting her senses were as potent as her oldest memories, starting with the sharp, chicory-laced coffee Hattie roasted right there in the iron skillet until it hit the perfect pitch of darkness, beans she grew herself in a patch behind the house. Beneath that was the rich, earthy scent of pot liquor and collard greens simmering with fatback, a dark broth seasoned with roots that the root women used, plants that had no proper names in the white man's English, and the unmistakable, comforting smell of sweet potatoes roasting in the ashes, the very crop she cultivated with her own hands, the foundation of every meal she offered and shared. "Rest yourself right there," Hattie instructed, gesturing toward a sturdy, hand-carved bench pulled up to the plank table, "and let me get a good look at you." Cora sank onto the wood, and the moment her weight settled, the fight drained entirely from her bones. Her feet, swollen to twice their size from the relentless dirt roads, began to throb with a vicious intensity. Yet the throbbing felt almost like a blessing, because it was an honest pain, a pain born of walking towards something rather than running away. Her heavy belly pressed flush against the edge of the table, and as Hattie studied her, without a shred of pity, without a single probing question, just bearing witness to her existence, Cora felt a sensation she hadn't known in a lifetime. She felt truly seen, not as chattel, not as a breeding mare, but as a living, breathing human soul. "When was the last time you put food in your belly?" Hattie asked, and Cora could only offer a slow shake of her head. She had chewed on some wild poke salad leaves she found growing by the creek hours ago, but that was hardly a meal to sustain a body. Moving back to the hearth without a word, Hattie lifted a heavy clay pot, nestling it closer to the glowing coals to heat the dark stew waiting inside. It was a thick chicken broth, thick with sweet corn and healing herbs, the kind of medicine that mends not just the flesh, but reaches deep into the spirit, touching places no master's whip or iron shackle could ever reach. She ladled it into a wooden bowl, setting a warm piece of cornbread beside it, and the sheer grace of that humble offering struck Cora so deeply it physically ached. "Eat it slow now, 'cause your bones are crying out for it, and that little one inside you is starving for it too." As Cora lifted the wooden spoon, the tears she had held back for miles finally broke loose, tracking down her dusty cheeks and falling straight into the broth, her weeping mingling with the nourishment provided by a place she loved, even if she couldn't yet articulate why. Hattie pulled up a chair, not across from her like an interrogator, but right beside her, and simply sat, offering her silent, steady presence while the broken girl ate and cried. Once the bowl was scraped clean, the old woman guided Cora to a small, quiet room tacked onto the back of the cabin. On the floor lay a tick mattress stuffed with fresh pine needles, covered by a cotton quilt that looked far too clean and neatly stitched to be a sudden coincidence. It was a bed prepared long in advance. A single beeswax candle flickered on a stump table, bundles of dried sage hung from the low rafters, and a small square window peered out over the sweet potato patch. "This is your place for as long as you have need of it, however long that might be," and as Cora parted her lips to bargain, to offer her labor to pay for her keep, to make the charity easier to swallow. But Hattie was already stepping out, pulling the door softly shut behind her. Lying on that pine needle mattress, Cora listened to the symphony of the night she had long forgotten. The wind whispering through the pines, the distant babble of the creek, the cicadas grinding out a high-pitched hum that felt like the earth's own heartbeat, all those wild southern night sounds that the crammed, miserable noise of the slave quarters forced you to block out, now singing to her like a choir. For the very first time since the plantation, midwife had touched her belly and confirmed her deepest dread. Cora finally let her eyes close without terror, and the child curled tight inside her, drifted into a peaceful sleep too. There were thousands of souls scattered across the piney woods and delta mud whose stories mirrored this exact quiet struggle for survival. These were the lives omitted from the leather-bound ledgers, the voices absent from the county newspapers, the quiet devotions no courthouse clerk ever bothered to write down. Every time one of these women is remembered, a little piece of the darkness is pushed back. The telling of their survival is a fire that refuses to be snuffed out, and so the story returns to Cora. She was jolted awake by the harsh crow of a rooster, a jagged sound that tore right through the early morning mist. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a raw, unapologetic demand that the world wake up and face the dawn. Blinking into the gloom, her mind raced, instinctively searching for the suffocating walls of the communal cabins, bracing for the press of sweaty bodies, the tangled breaths of strangers, and the muffled cries of hungry children. But she was met only with a profound, unbroken stillness, a vast and glorious emptiness. Through the small square window, the indigo blue of the pre-dawn sky spilled into the room, falling over her like an absolute blessing. Moving with slow, aching caution, Cora pushed herself up, bracing the heavy weight of her child with both hands, and drifted toward the glassless window. The sky held that fragile, bruised blue color that only exists in the fleeting breath before the sun breaks the horizon, when the whole earth holds perfectly still. Out in the dirt yard, the hens were already in motion, their wings flapping softly as their quick bodies darted after the scatter of feed hitting the soil. and walking among them, swinging a tin bucket with an easy rhythm, was a man. Cora had no idea what he was called. She recalled only a dark, silent shadow from the night before, a man who had lifted her heavy sack and vanished into the cabin without uttering a single syllable. Now, watching from the safety of the dark room, she saw a man who moved across the dirt, as if he knew the texture of every grain of soil by heart. His motions were deliberate, utterly unhurried, grounded in a deep and quiet calm despite the early hour. He cast the cracked corn to the birds with wide, sweeping throws of his hand. There was a grace to his labor, a precision forged over countless years that had surely begun under the brutal eye of a driver on some plantation. But the labor was now entirely his own, the movements of a man who figured out that the work of your own hands could be its own kind of salvation. He never once glanced up at the small window, completely unaware of the eyes tracking him. Following the smell of wood smoke, Cora padded down to the hearth where Hattie was already stirring pots. The old woman was completely put together, her head wrapped tight and her apron tied, moving with the brisk energy of someone who refuses to let the daylight get ahead of her. Catching sight of Cora, Hattie's face broke into a smile, the straightforward, unvarnished kind of smile unique to the older women of their bloodline who had looked the devil in the eye and lived. "Did the night treat you well?" she asked, and Cora answered with a quiet yes, telling her the honest truth that she had rested deeply. "Pull up a seat, child. I've got chicory brewing." She handed over a steaming cup cut with rich milk, alongside a piece of hoe cake baked fresh in the ashes before dawn, and Cora sat back down on that sturdy wooden bench. It felt as if the wood had already shaped itself to welcome her, while Hattie checked the boiling kettle, listing off the day's tasks as if Cora had been there for years. "Got to check the nesting boxes after this. The hens are giving plenty right now, and then Silas has got the milking to do. Pails are ready, and the greens need watering before the sun gets too high, plus the sweet potatoes are coming in thick." She paused, leveling a look at Cora that seemed to strip away all pretense. "You figuring on keeping company out here, or you want to lay back down in that bed?" "I'll stay right here," Cora shot back, a tremor of panic in her voice as if failing to work meant she'd be cast back out into the woods. "I can make myself useful." Hattie's mouth didn't smile, but the hard lines around her eyes melted. "That's fine, but you don't push that body. You're carrying a child of the water spirits, not a sack of rocks." The coffee burned Cora's hands through the hollowed-out gourd dipper it was served in. She took tiny, reverent sips, the rich taste dragging her not back to the watery, cold slop the plantation cooks handed out, but straight into a feeling of belonging, an emotion she thought had been beaten out of her long ago. There was such a profound grace in the quiet morning that a hard knot inside Cora's chest finally snapped, not breaking her, but setting something trapped completely free. There was no master demanding her sweat here, no overseer with a leather whip, just the honest truth of the soil. The beans were just beans, the dirt was just dirt, and the old woman standing by the fire was exactly the unyielding fortress she appeared to be. The shift happened right then. The very first morning Cora drank from a gourd cup and realized nobody was marching her back to a cotton row. Wiping her hands, Hattie grabbed a woven basket and pointed a calloused finger toward the yard. "Come on out. Just walk behind me and watch how it goes. The eggs are hiding in those wooden crates yonder. You reach in slow now, 'cause some of these old birds are mean enough to take a piece of your finger." Cora trailed behind her, her heavy swaying steps negotiating the uneven ground. The morning breeze was sharp and clean, nothing like the stifling manicured air of the big house verandas where she used to sweep, but the raw, damp smell of wet pine needles and wild earth. The yard was wide open, the red dirt packed down so hard it scraped against the soles of her feet. Right dead in the middle sat a deep stone well, its rusty iron bucket dangling from a frayed hemp rope. The chickens scattered the second Hattie stepped close, possessing a wild survival instinct the white folks never gave them credit for. "Right in there," Hattie said, gesturing to a slatted crate in the shadows. "See what they left us." Cora bent at the knees, agonizingly slow because her swollen body refused to be rushed, and slid her hand into the dark, rustling hay. Her fingers brushed against the warm straw, finding one smooth shell, then another, and another. She placed each one into the basket, with the trembling care of someone handling spun glass, treating them like the fragile treasures they were. As she worked, the heavy thud of bare feet on the packed dirt grew louder. They were the quick, certain steps of a man who knew exactly where the roots and rocks laid buried on that path. Pulling herself upright, she saw him walking toward old Hattie. He was carrying 2 heavy metal pails sloshing with fresh milk, the creamy white surface throwing off wisps of steam into the crisp air. "Brought it all in, Aunt Hattie," he rumbled, and it was the very first time Cora had heard the timbre of his voice. It was a low, raspy sound, dragging up from the deep chest of a man who kept his mouth shut, because he had learned the hard way that a slave's words were expensive, and every syllable could earn you a strike of the lash. Hattie gave a curt nod of approval. "Good man, Silas, now go on and see to the fence line, you hear?" He dipped his chin in agreement, and right as he turned, his dark eyes locked straight onto Cora's. The air between them pulled taut, stalling the morning for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't the sweeping, foolish romance the white ladies read about in their parlor books. It was stark and true. He saw a young woman with fresh freedom papers, heavy with child, her face carved by exhaustion and a brutal journey. She saw a man with skin the color of a moonless midnight, the backs of his hands spider-webbed with pale scars that whispered loudly of endless labor, deep suffering, and a stubborn refusal to break. He possessed the rugged, striking dignity of a man who worked the earth honestly and had kept his soul intact when they tried to crush it. His eyes dropped to the heavy basket of eggs she was cradling, reading the wince of pain in her posture from the strain of bending over, and a subtle shift crossed his features. It was just a flicker, a brief softening of the jaw, the silent recognition of a man who intimately knew the crushing weight of burdens, recognizing when someone else's load was too heavy to bear. "Morning to you," he said, the bass in his voice dropping even lower. "You the girl that walked in last night?" "I am," Cora whispered, the sound coming out much smaller than she wanted. "My name's Cora." He gave a single, respectful nod. "I go by Silas. I don't mean no disrespect, but you need any lifting done, there's folks here to carry the heavy loads, all right?" It wasn't posed as a question, it was a quiet declaration, a vow offered with no strings attached and no hidden debts to collect. Before Cora could even find her voice, Hattie was already barking orders. "Silas, go draw up some water from the well for her. Plenty of it too. A woman carrying a baby drinks a river dry if you let her." Silas nodded once more, spinning on his heel toward the well, his bare heels kicking up little clouds of red Georgia dust. Those first few weeks were a quiet study in watching the world work. Cora learned the breathing pattern of the homestead, treating it less like a machine and more like a living, breathing creature that demanded sweat and gave life in return. She watched the livestock eat, marveled at Hattie commanding the fire like a root doctor dancing with the flames, and kept an eye on the greens pushing through the dirt, the tall stalks of corn, the sweet potatoes, and the beans wrapping themselves tightly around the wooden poles. And always, hovering just at the edge of her vision, there was Silas, quietly keeping watch over her without ever crowding her space, never pushing too hard, just standing steady like the massive shadow of the oak tree shielding the porch from the blazing afternoon heat. When the sun finally bled out over the tree line, Hattie brought out bowls of dark beans and roasted squash. There was fresh hoe cake, a slice of goat cheese and cold well water, and as Cora climbed the ladder to her room, she caught the low murmur of Hattie talking to the man below. "That girl been on her feet since dawn. She's delicate right now, but she's got an iron rod in her spine she don't even know about yet." And the deep, gravelly hum of Silas answering, "We're gonna look after her, Aunt Hattie. We're gonna look out for her." Cora laid back on her pine needle tick, her heart resting easy in the knowledge that she was seen, that her fragility was protected, that she mattered. And that night, the little life tumbling inside her womb seemed to kick with a little less fear, too. By the time a month had passed, Cora's body was waking up before the rooster even thought about making a sound, her blood sinking to the rhythm of the woods faster than her mind could keep up. She'd lie in the pitch black, just letting the sounds of the deep night wash over her. It was the kind of heavy, holy silence you only find miles away from the driver's horn, a quiet that seeps right up from the roots of the trees. Through the floorboards, she could hear Hattie already moving around the hearth, getting the chicory hot for the long day ahead. On one particular morning, A day Cora didn't yet realize would crack her entire world wide open and rewrite every truth she clung to. Hattie looked up from the fire and declared, "Today, we're wrapping corn dodgers and ash cakes." Cora only knew the taste of them, the sweet, earthy corn mash the enslaved folks were sometimes allowed to make around harvest time, if the master was in a forgiving mood. But she had never watched them made by hands that belonged only to themselves, hands entirely free. A mountain of fresh corn was already piled out in the yard. Silas had stayed out late the evening before, stripping the ears, bright yellow kernels gleaming like true gold. He had stacked it all neatly in the corner, throwing burlap sacks over the pile to keep the morning dew off. "You figure on learning how?" Hattie asked, and it wasn't a request for labor. It was an invitation. It was the old woman's way of saying, "You are one of us now." The two women dragged their stools under the massive shade of the oak. The dry leaves drifted down around their ankles, soft and curling at the edges where the green was giving way to yellow. Hattie didn't use her words to teach. She just let her gnarled hands do the talking while Cora shadowed her every move. Cora's fingers, which had spent years scrubbing copper pots and sweeping fine rugs in the white folks' big house, now had to learn the coarse, honest friction of dried husks and raw earth. Halfway through the morning, Silas walked up. He had just finished hauling up the daily water from the deep well, the back-breaking chore nobody ever asked him to do, but that kept them all alive. He spotted the two women buried elbow-deep in the corn husks. He stopped, watching the rhythm of their work for a long heartbeat, and then without a single word bent down and started gathering the discarded husks from the dirt, stacking them up so they wouldn't trip anyone. Then he fetched the tin grater from the kitchen and sat right down on the ground to grind the kernels. He didn't wait for an order. He just saw a heavy load and put his own shoulders under it, operating by the unspoken law of folks who carry a deep, abiding respect for one another. Cora watched him shred the ears with a brutal efficiency her own tired hands lacked. His knuckles flew back and forth steady and hard, the sweet yellow mash piling high in the heavy clay bowl between his knees. There was a rugged poetry in it, the cadence of a body that knows the absolute truth of hard labor, a man who took pride in doing a job right because the work belonged to him now. "Silas, you aiming to work this batch with me?" Hattie called out. "If you'll have me, Auntie," he replied softly. And right there, the three of them, the ancient woman who outlived the slave ships, the broken girl learning how to breathe free air, and the scarred man who spoke his heart through his calluses, began to wrap the corn. The magic was all in how you folded the husks. You scooped the mash deep into the leaf, then tucked the ends tight, binding it into a neat little pouch. Hattie's fingers moved with a muscle memory that went back generations. Cora locked her eyes on those weathered hands and mirrored them. One pouch, then a second. Her trembling fingers started to find their confidence. A quiet strength seeped into her grip that hadn't been there when she arrived. Silas was working right beside her, and every so often their knuckles would brush as they reached for the same pile of shucks. Neither of them pulled away, neither apologized. They just let the warmth linger and kept on working. "You done this kind of work before?" Cora asked him, keeping her eyes glued to the corn, her voice barely a whisper. "I have," he said, his voice thick with a sudden ache. "My grandmammy showed me how. Ash cakes, hoe cakes, cracklin' bread. We made it all when the harvest came." There was a brutal sorrow flashing across his face, gone before Cora could truly read it, but leaving a shadow as permanent as the pale scars roping across his skin. "Your grandmammy." Cora pushed gently. "Master sold her down the river when I was turning 15. Ain't had the heart to wrap a proper ash cake since that day. Aunt Hattie was the one who brought it back to me." Hattie was listening quietly as she stacked the finished cakes into a wide iron pan. She kept her mouth shut, but the rigid line of her shoulders dropped an inch or two when Silas spoke his truth. What Cora couldn't possibly know, what she wouldn't figure out until years had passed, was that Hattie had orchestrated this entire morning with the ruthless precision of a farmer planting a seed before the rain. Hattie knew the secrets the young folks hadn't learned yet. She knew that when people have been beaten down by the world, love doesn't spark from sweet talk. It blooms out of shared sweat. It grows when hands accidentally touch over a pile of grated corn. It takes root When the silence between two people stops feeling empty and starts feeling like home. They worked through the heat of the day, folding dozens of cakes until their joints screamed, but it was a righteous pain, the ache of hands building something that truly mattered. When the last leaf was tied, Hattie took a massive breath and beamed. Tomorrow we fire the hearth, and then we take the wagon to town to sell them fresh. She announced it like a king declaring a victory because to her it was. It was the fruit of her own land, her own genius, dirt that no white man had handed her out of the goodness of his heart. There was no shame in this sweat. It was pure, unadulterated dignity. Later that evening, as Hattie was putting the kitchen to rights, Silas stepped up and offered his elbow to help Cora up the porch stairs. But this time, he offered something heavier. "You're carrying mighty low now," he murmured, his hand steadying her arm. "I'm in my 9th month," Cora breathed back. "It won't be long." Silas froze on the middle step. "You scared of it?" he asked, bringing the terrible, unspoken truth straight into the open. Nobody had dared ask her, not even old Hattie. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, pretending the terror wasn't there so Cora wouldn't shatter. Cora stopped walking. "I am. I'm terrified." Silas looked at her with eyes that understood the absolute depths of her panic. Eyes of a man who knew that admitting your fear didn't make you a coward. It just meant the burden was too heavy for one back to bear. "When the water breaks, Aunt Hattie knows the root medicine, and I'm going to be right on this porch if you need a thing. Lord willing, you'll come through the fire." He didn't feed her empty fairy tales. He offered her the only truth that mattered. "You ain't going into the dark alone." Cora let him guide her up the rest of the steps, and for the first time in her life, the quiet between a man and a woman didn't feel like a threat. It was a silence that threw a blanket over her shoulders. It was a silence that kept watch. By the time another month bled away, Cora couldn't even pinpoint when she started tracking Silas's quiet devotions. Maybe it was the crisp morning she walked out and found the firewood split and neatly stacked right by the hearth. The logs had been chopped down to half their normal size, small enough that a pregnant woman wouldn't strain her back lifting them. Or maybe it was the afternoon the wash basin was left sitting out for her, filled with sun-warmed water and sweet-smelling pine needles that nobody had asked him to gather. Or the dawn she shuffled into the kitchen to find a thick slice of hoe cake waiting under a clean rag, next to a piece of goat cheese sliced up small, so she could eat it with one hand while her other arm rested under her heavy belly. Tiny, invisible acts of grace. At first they looked like accidents, but over those long months of watching her life burn down and rise from the ashes, Cora had learned to spot the hand of intention. And these devotions were far too meticulous to be accidents. One blistering afternoon, as Cora sat in the dirt yard shucking dried ears, because she was a fixed part of this farm now, pulling her own weight, Silas walked over, carrying a wooden stool with a sturdy backrest. "Don't mean no harm, but you need to sit up off the ground. Take the strain off that child." He dropped the stool beside her and melted away. But hours later, when the Georgia sun turned the yard into a frying pan, she looked up to see a rigging of sweet gum branches and an old canvas tarp pitched over her head. A makeshift canopy he must have built in the dead of night, because she hadn't heard a single hammer strike. "So the sun don't blister you," he muttered, walking past her, like a man offering a cup of water in a drought. One night, while Hattie stirred the pot and Cora rested her swollen feet, Silas was out in the yard sweeping the dust. Hattie turned from the fire, fixing Cora with a stare that stripped paint off a wall. "You got feelings for that boy?" Cora felt the heat rush straight to her hairline. "Now listen, I ain't asking to be a nosy old hen. I'm asking to know if you feel safe under my roof, if he's making you nervous." Cora took a long, trembling breath. "He's a righteous man. I know that much." "That he is," Hattie agreed, stirring the pot. "But that ain't what I asked you. I asked if you care for him." Cora looked at the old woman, and for the first time, let the dam break. "He looks out for me. Ain't nobody in my whole life ever done that. Nobody who didn't want a piece of my flesh in return." Hattie gave a slow nod, satisfied she had struck the truth. "Well, I'll tell you this. That boy is deeply in love with you. You might think you're hiding it, but he loves you. And a man like Silas don't hand his heart over to just anybody." He loves with his back, with his sweat, with his quiet ways. He loves the way a man tends a field, working the dirt till it gives life. I ain't gonna push you. Take all the days you need. But if you decide to plant your roots here, if you choose that man, you won't be making a fool's wager. He is a good man. And you deserve good, Cora. More than your bruised heart even knows. That night, Cora laid on the mattress, her mind spinning with Silas. The dark intensity of his eyes, the protective arc of his hands, the way he seemed to be holding his breath, waiting with the endless patience of a mountain, for something she wasn't quite ready to hand over. And her thoughts drifted to the baby, the fatherless child about to break into the world, unless she chose to give it a father, unless she reached out and pulled Silas in from the yard. Out under the massive oak, Silas sat staring at the hazy stars. His mind was running down the exact same tracks. He was biding his time. Men who coax life out of hard clay know how to wait for the rain. They know that the sweetest fruit takes a long time to ripen, needing steady water, rich soil, and an iron will. And he had nothing but time to give her. Deep inside Cora's belly, the baby rolled hard. The kicks were frantic now, desperate, as if the child knew the waiting was over, that the hour of reckoning was knocking on the door. And when that door opened, the whole earth would shift. The labor hit her on a Tuesday that woke up looking just like any other sticky southern morning. But it wasn't. It was the day the world split open, the day one beating heart became two, the brutal finish line of 9 months of terror. The night before had been suffocating, the air thick as molasses, making sleep a luxury her aching body couldn't afford. Around 3 in the morning, Cora had dragged herself out to the hearth, finding Hattie already boiling the chicory as if the sun were high in the sky. "Sleep won't come?" Hattie asked, holding out a steaming dipper. "I can't catch my breath. My middle is cramping up hard, but it ain't the real pain yet, I don't think. It's just a wicked ache." Hattie locked her pale eyes onto the girl for a long time. Then she stepped close, laying a heavy, warm hand directly over Cora's womb. She felt the tension in the muscle, reading the body with the ancient knowledge of a woman who had delivered 7 of her own, pulled 50 more from other women, and grieved over babies sold off to other plantations before they could even walk. It's starting. The baby has dropped low. It's knocking at the door. Cold panic flooded Cora's veins. "But I got 2 weeks left." "Babies don't care about the white man's almanac," Hattie shot back smoothly. "It comes when it's good and ready, and yours is ready right now." The old woman's energy shifted on a dime. She started moving with a militant focus, grabbing boiled rags, stoking the fire till it roared, pulling down the dried raspberry leaf and black cohosh root with the practiced hands of a conjure woman. There was no fear in her. Only the cold, brilliant calm of a veteran stepping onto a battlefield she knew by heart. "Sit down. I'm brewing you a root tea to loosen the muscles. Drink it while it's scalding." The brew tasted like dark earth and bitter bark, plants Hattie had scavenged from the deep woods, ancient medicine passed from mother to daughter since before the ships crossed the ocean. When Silas woke up, sensing the shift in the house's bones, he walked into the kitchen and saw Hattie's hands flying and Cora clutching her stomach. He read the room in a single breath. "Now?" he asked Hattie, the gravel in his voice cracking with a fierce, protective terror. Not the worry of a farmhand, but the deep dread of a man watching his own heart go into the fire. "Looks like it, but we're getting the ground ready," Hattie threw back. Silas didn't ask what was needed. He turned into a machine. He hauled buckets of water from the well, stacking cordwood by the hearth to keep the iron black and hot, moving with a fluid grace as if he had rehearsed this very morning in his dreams. He had already built a home for this child in his mind, long before he ever spoke the words. The contractions stayed dull through the morning. They rolled in, squeezed, and faded. Cora paced the floorboards like a trapped panther. She walked, she squatted, she walked again. Hattie let her roam, knowing the body possessed an ancient wisdom that the terrified mind tried to fight. Silas shadowed her, not suffocating her but never out of arm's reach. If she stumbled, his hand was there. When she slumped against the wall, he slid a chair under her. He pressed cups of water to her lips, offered her bits of bread, doing the invisible, holy work of holding a person up when their legs give out. "How you holding up?" he whispered when they stood near the window, watching the sun drag across the yard. "I'm so scared I could die," Cora answered, her voice breaking. "But somehow, I ain't running. It's crazy. It's 'cause you ain't in the dark by yourself," Silas said, his voice a steady rumble. "Fear shrinks down when you got somebody standing in it with you." Cora looked up at his scarred face, and the wall she had built around her heart finally shattered, letting in a flood of pure, agonizing gratitude, maybe even love. But mostly, it was the staggering relief of knowing this man wasn't going to turn his back and vanish like the master who had casually signed her freedom paper to get rid of a problem. When the sun dropped, the real agony hit. Cora felt the shift like a lightning strike. These weren't cramps anymore. They were tidal waves of fire starting in her spine and ripping through her pelvis. A violence that demanded she surrender. This was the brutal toll of bringing life into the world, the same agony women endured in the filthy, crowded slave quarters while the overseer yelled for them to keep quiet. But Cora wasn't in the quarters. She was in Hattie's cabin, wrapped in a fortress of care. Hattie practically carried her to the mattress in the back room. The sanctuary where Cora had healed for 3 months was about to become the altar of her rebirth. The old woman lit 3 beeswax candles, spread out the boiled flour sacks, and brought the steaming basins to the bedside. She crushed the black cohosh to cut the pain and hurry the blood. She did the sacred work of women, and then the heavy metallic silence of the birthing room descended. The flames danced on the log walls. The water hissed over the fire in the other room. "You got the strength for this," Hattie commanded, wiping the freezing sweat from Cora's brow. "Your flesh knows the way. You got iron in your blood. The women of our line are built out of rock. We were made to survive." It wasn't a lament about their cursed lot in life, it was a battle cry, a testament to a ferocious resilience that no slaver's whip or iron collar had ever managed to beat out of them. Cora didn't feel like iron. She felt like a tree being split by an axe. But Hattie anchored her, demanding she suck in the air when she wanted to scream, gripping her jaw when Cora begged to just die. And right on the other side of that thin wooden door stood Silas, pacing, sweating, refusing to leave, refusing to run the way men do when the blood and the screaming start. Before the worst of it hit, Hattie had cornered him. "When the devil comes for her, you plant your feet right outside this door." She needs to know a man is holding the line for her. Time collapsed. It might have been 2 hours, it could have been 10. Cora only knew a world of blinding white pain and Hattie's voice drilling into her ear. "That's it. Push through the fire. The baby is right there, feel it. Your child is fighting to get to you. One more heave, your little girl is trying to see the sky. Open the door for her, little girl." Hattie had said girl. Cora clamped her eyes shut as the contraction peaked into a blinding, suffocating agony. A torture that had no name in the white man's dictionary. And right at the absolute crest of the pain, she tore her throat open and screamed a name. "Silas!" He ripped the door open before the echo faded. He had been standing with his hand on the latch, praying to be called. "I got you," he choked out, dropping to his knees beside the mattress. Hattie didn't chase him out. She knew the medicine Cora needed now wasn't roots. "I'm so scared," Cora sobbed, thrashing on the wet sheets. "I can't do it." Silas grabbed her flailing hand. His grip was massive, calloused, burning hot, the grip of a man who could shoulder the weight of a collapsed roof without buckling. "You ain't scared, you're just being brave," he said, his voice shaking. "Bravery is just doing the work when you're terrified." Cora clamped her fingers down on his hand, squeezing with a violent, desperate force that drove her nails into his flesh. She nearly broke his fingers, and Silas didn't even flinch. He let her crush his hand because he understood that this was his part of the labor. Her job was to bleed and push. His job was to be the anvil she struck against. He knelt in the dirt, absorbing her agony, his silence a shield around her. The pain receded, then roared back like a hurricane. Again and again. And right when Cora felt her soul tearing loose from her body, her muscles seized in one final catastrophic heave, a violent push that felt less like pain and more like a massive chain snapping. And then a shriek pierced the room. It wasn't Cora's scream. It was a brand new sound, a furious, squalling cry that hadn't existed on this earth a second ago. It was the raw, untamed noise of a soul hitting the cold air of the world for the very first time. Hattie lifted the tiny, slick body from the bloody sheets. A screaming little girl covered in the white grease of the womb, and she pressed the wet, thrashing weight directly onto Cora's bare chest. "Look at her," Hattie wept. "Look at your baby girl." Cora stared down at the impossible creature she had forged in her own darkness. She had a shock of pitch-black hair, as dark as Silas's. Her tiny fists were balled up tight, ready for a fight, screaming in outrage at the freezing air. She was flawless. She was the miracle Cora had carried across miles of red dirt, fueled by nothing but terror and grief. Hot, blinding tears poured down Cora's face, washing the sweat away. It wasn't pain anymore. It was an overwhelming, violent surge of pure love that threatened to crack her ribs. She wrapped her shaking arms around her daughter, feeling that frantic, rapid-fire heartbeat thumping against her own skin, a brand new rhythm in the universe. Hattie tied off the cord. She moved with the ruthless efficiency of a woman finishing a holy ritual, clearing away the blood-soaked rags, swabbing Cora down and tucking a clean quilt around the mother and child. Once the room was scrubbed of the chaos, Hattie stepped out to the kitchen. Cora couldn't make out the old woman's words, but a second later she heard Silas break down. The silent, stone-faced man, the man who swallowed his pain so deep you couldn't find it with a shovel, let out a gut-wrenching sob. It was the wail of a man who had finally been given something worth living for. It was a vow screamed into the wood of the cabin. It was a love he couldn't put into English, tearing its way out of his throat. A few days later, when Cora finally found her legs again, she sat out on the porch with the little girl bundled against her collarbone. Silas stepped out of the shadows, carrying a tin basin of steaming water laced with herbs. "You got to keep the cuts clean," he murmured, kneeling by her feet. "It draws the fever out." As he meticulously cleaned the area, working with the tender reverence he applied to everything he touched, Cora stared at the scarred planes of his face and saw the absolute truth. It was a fierce, abiding love, not the cheap romance the white planters read about. This was the love of a man who stays in the bloody room, a man who holds the roof up when the storm hits. "You want to hear what I named her?" Cora asked softly. Silas went perfectly still, the rag hovering over the basin. He looked at the baby, his eyes wide. "Tell me Pearl, Pearl Hattie, Hattie for the woman who saved me, and Pearl because it takes a whole lot of grit and pain to make something that beautiful. And Silas, you gave us the grit." A tremor ripped across Silas's face, unearthing something buried deep. He smiled. It was a massive, blinding smile that shattered the hard mask he had worn his entire life, a smile that poured out every ounce of devotion he couldn't speak. And sitting on that porch, Cora realized she was finally seeing the man as he was meant to be, before the whip and the chains had forced him into silence. The man who outlasted the devil. He asked her to marry him in late October, under a sky choked with stars, the air heavy with the smell of crushed pine needles. They were sitting on the steps, Pearl asleep on Cora's chest, Hattie snoring lightly inside. "You figure you could marry me?" Silas asked, throwing the words out into the dark like he was asking about the rain. Cora snapped her head toward him. "Marry? Silas, ain't no white preacher gonna read vows over a freedman and a runaway. You know the law, I know the law," Silas said, his voice like iron. "But Aunt Hattie knows a circuit rider passing through, and the courthouse paper don't mean spit to me. All that matters is that I'm choosing you, and I'm choosing Pearl. I want to build a family out of this dirt." The tears spilled over Cora's lashes before she could stop them. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, I'll marry you." When Hattie heard the next morning, she gave that knowing, crooked grin. "'Bout damn time. You track down that preacher, Silas, and I'll see to cutting up my good cotton for a dress. And boy, you better strip the woods for wildflowers. Folks like us deserve a little beauty, even if the world thinks we're just dirt." 2 weeks later, Cora stood on the porch in a bone-white cotton dress Hattie had meticulously stitched together. The old woman had greased and braided Cora's hair, weaving bright strips of dyed fabric into the tight coils. "You look like a queen," Hattie whispered, her voice thick with a rare, naked emotion. "You look so shining. It's like the pain never got its claws in you." "But it did. And you shine brighter because you walked through the fire and didn't burn up." Silas stood in the dirt yard wearing a pair of clean trousers and a rough shirt he had boiled and beaten against the rocks until it was immaculate. His massive hands were wrapped around a bouquet of wild magnolias and dogwood blossoms he had spent all morning hunting down. When he saw Cora step onto the porch holding little Pearl, because the baby was the living proof of their survival, his knees nearly gave out. Every drop of sweat, every year of biting his tongue, every welt on his back finally meant something. Hattie stood right behind Cora, her sharp eyes taking in the holy weight of the moment. As the circuit rider opened his Bible, the old woman placed a heavy, grounding hand on Cora's shoulder. It was a touch that threw an invisible shield over the girl, a touch that screamed, "You belong to us now, and you are untouchable." "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked. "I do," Silas boomed, his voice echoing off the trees. "I do," Cora whispered back, trembling violently. When Silas leaned down to kiss her, Hattie broke down. Not the weeping of the heartbroken, but the violent sobbing of the victorious. It was a lifetime of hoarded joy breaking through the dam. They laid out a feast on the plank table afterward, honest food pulled straight from the earth. There was crackling bread, the goat cheese Cora had learned to press, a massive pot of chicken stew thick with roots, and a sweet potato pie a neighbor from down the creek had brought up. Hattie stood at the head of the table, holding court. "Look at this man," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at Silas. "He ain't never had a soul choose him first. Now he does. Look at this woman," pointing to Cora. "She never had a man stay when the wind blew hard. Now she does. And that baby girl never had a daddy who claimed her. Now she's got a king for a father. This right here is what marriage is. It ain't a master's permission slip. It's digging your heels in. It's building your own bloodline when the white man tried to erase yours. 3 years passed like water. Sitting on that very same porch with the Georgia sky bruising purple over the pines, Cora rocked Amos on her hip. He was the boy she and Silas had made together. Born easy into the world because Cora's body knew the path now, and she knew she wasn't bleeding alone. Pearl, now a wild 3-year-old, was tearing across the yard chasing a terrified hen, shrieking with a joy so pure it felt like a prayer. Hattie, pushing 75, was anchored in her rocking chair, watching the chaos with the satisfied look of a general who had won the final war. Her legs were giving out. The decades of relentless labor were finally calling in their debts, but she was right where she belonged. "You made a family out of the scraps," she muttered into the evening air. It wasn't a compliment. It was the gospel truth. Later that night, with the children tucked in and the moon silvering the dirt yard, Hattie called Cora to the hearth. "Sit down, girl. We need to talk business." Cora sat, her stomach tightening. When Hattie used that voice, the earth was about to shift. "When the Lord calls me home," Hattie started, and as Cora opened her mouth to argue, the old woman raised a hand like an axe. "Shut your mouth and listen. When I pass, and I will, 'cause everything turns to dust, this piece of earth might not belong to me on the county clerk's map, but it's mine in the blood and sweat I poured into the roots. When I go, this cabin is yours. I talked to the right folks in town, greased the right palms. Everything I built, I leave to you two, 'cause you brought the life back into this dead wood." The silence that fell was suffocating, but it was the kind of heavy quiet that knits broken bones back together. Silas, who had been leaning against the doorframe, walked over and laid his massive hand gently on Hattie's frail shoulder. It was his way of pouring out 1,000 thank yous that his tongue couldn't form. And Hattie felt every word of it, because she had cracked the code of Silas's heart years ago, back when she found him wandering broken in the woods and handed him a shovel and his pride. When Hattie went to her bed, Cora and Silas sat out on the dark porch. The quiet between them felt like a physical weight, the rich exhaustion of a crop safely brought to the barn. "You doing all right?" Silas asked low. "I am," Cora whispered. "I'm happy, Silas. It feels like a sin to say it out loud, but I am." "You earned the right to say it," he replied. "Since the minute you dragged yourself up these steps looking like a whipped dog, you deserve some light." Looking around the dark kitchen, smelling the faint ghost of wood smoke and roasting corn, Cora knew she had walked into her promised land, not because a master gave it to her, but because she took the dirt and built it herself, with her own 2 hands and a ferocious refusal to die. 5 years down the line, Hattie slipped away in her sleep. Cora found her when she went to brew the morning coffee. The old woman was laid out on her mattress, her face completely smooth, the tension of 70 years of warfare finally wiped clean. Cora didn't wail. She just accepted it. Hattie had stayed on this earth just long enough to see her seeds become a forest. She had watched Cora harden into a fierce woman of the land, a root doctor pulling the babies of other frightened runaway girls. She watched Silas learn how to breathe without waiting for the whip. She saw the babies grow, Pearl, Amos, and the newest one, little Hattie toddling in the dirt. The sanctuary she had carved out of the wilderness was in the hands of the warriors she trained. She had earned her rest, but Hattie's ghost never left the pines. She lived in the exact way Cora chopped the cohosh root for a screaming girl in labor. She lived in the fierce way Cora guarded her children. She lived in the hoe cake recipe Cora was teaching Pearl, ancient magic carried across the Atlantic Ocean, tucked inside the minds of women who were stripped of everything else. Hattie was the cabin itself. It was the summer of 1865. A rider in a blue uniform came tearing up the dirt road, his horse kicking up clouds of red dust, waving a broadside over his head. "The war is over," he shouted, his voice cracking. "General Order Number 3. The slaves are free. Hey, it's the law of the land." Cora stared at the soldier for a long, vibrating minute. She felt Silas step up beside her, his rough fingers tangling into hers. Pearl grabbed handfuls of her skirt. Little Hattie was asleep against her collarbone. "You understand what I'm saying, woman," the soldier yelled. "I hear you," Cora called back. "It means my girls are free on the white man's paper now, not just in my house." The soldier spurred his horse, confused, but Silas squeezed her hand. A new fire flared in Silas's dark eyes, a furious, blinding pride of a man who had declared himself a king long before the government gave him permission. That evening, looking out over the hazy Georgia pines with her family tangled around her legs, Cora thought of old Hattie. She thought of the heavy oak door swinging open when the rest of the world wanted her dead. She thought of the staggering debt she owed and how she had paid it back in sweat and devotion. She realized the only holy truth left in the world, that love is a plow. You have to rip the earth open to get anything out of it. But if you bleed into the soil, it pays you back tenfold. A calloused hand dropped onto her shoulder. "You doing all right?" Silas asked, ever the watchman. "I miss her," Cora breathed, "but I'm right as rain. She built this fortress for us. We're safe inside." Silas lowered his heavy frame onto the step beside her, and they let the silence stretch out. Out beyond the tree line, the sky caught fire, burning out the last of the day. And sitting in the quiet of a cabin raised by the hands of slaves who made themselves free, Cora felt Hattie breathing in the wind. Not as a haunting, but as a root driven so deep into the bedrock that nothing could ever tear it out. Cora had dragged herself to this porch as a broken, bleeding question, a discarded piece of flesh with swollen feet and a fatherless child. But walking back into the cabin that night, crossing the threshold toward her bed, she wasn't a question anymore. She was the absolute answer, the heir Hattie had prayed for, the anchor Silas had bled for, the matriarch this piece of earth demanded, the terrifying silence of the deep woods, the silence that had nearly broken her that first night, had been forged into a shield. It was the sound of a bloodline that refused to be erased. It was the deafening roar of survival. And survival, Cora knew deep in her bones, was more than enough. It was everything.